Under a blood-red sunset, Jonas McCrae stood knee-deep in mud, shielding the boy they spat on, the boy they called a mistake. Stones rained down like judgment, but Jonas didn't flinch. He wrapped his arms around that child, his voice rising above the hateful whispers that had chained him for years. This child is mine, my blood, my name. I do not hide him anymore. They said a man like Jonas, half outlaw, half broken legend, would never claim a son born of a forbidden past. They said he'd let the shame bury them both. But they were wrong, because that night, Jonas McCrae chose truth over fear, blood over pride, and it changed everything. This is the story of the storm that followed, and the love that refused to die. Long before Eleanor Shaw stood under that storm-torn sky with a child in her arms, she stood behind the ragged canvas walls of a frontier stockade in Wyoming Pass. It was the last brutal year of the Civil War, a year when hope and cruelty often shared the same bunk. The stockade was little more than split cedar posts driven into frozen ground, a crude cage for men the war didn't know what to do with. Confederate deserters, Union runaways, and Native scouts who'd been caught between loyalties. They all ended up here, half starved, half forgotten. Eleanor was barely 20 then, her nurse's band a strip of stained cloth tied to her sleeve. She'd followed a hospital wagon west with nothing but a cracked medical kit and the promise she'd made her father as he lay dying of fever. If you find someone bleeding, you stop the bleeding, no matter who they are. Inside the stockade, that promise was tested every dawn. Frost rimed the edges of rough cots. Moans rose like ghosts through the thin canvas. The men's eyes were wild with fever or hunger or both. Some spat at her boots when she brought water. Some pressed trembling hands to hers, grateful that for 5 minutes they were seen as men. Not enemy, not savage, not traitor. Just men. It was there she first noticed Jonas McCrae. Taller than most, shoulders square even when shackled. He was Cheyenne, though the officers just called him Redskin Prisoner on their supply ledgers. He had been captured in a dawn raid meant to break his people's will. Instead, it had torn him from his family and left him in this pen, his dark hair tangled, his eyes steady and strangely calm. At first, Eleanor avoided him. She'd been warned, don't waste your bandages on them. They heal like wolves or die like them. But one night, as the stockade shivered under a freezing rain, she caught him kneeling in the mud beside a dying boy. Jonas pressed a wet rag to the boy's forehead, murmuring words in a language Eleanor couldn't name. The other prisoners edged away, afraid of the quiet power in his voice. That moment stayed with her. Sometimes she'd watch him when she thought he didn't see. How he carved tiny toys from scraps of pine, slipping them to the camp's children when the guards weren't looking. How he ate the smallest portion of rations and gave the rest to the weakest. These stories remind us that compassion can bloom in the darkest places, even when every rule says it shouldn't. The narrator's words drift in here, reminding the audience that what grows in shadows can outlive a battlefield. Jonas was not the only hidden kindness Eleanor would remember. There was a real man, Samuel Price, a Union corporal who fell for a Southern farm girl near Franklin. When his regiment camped in her father's orchard, they traded whispers through the branches, apples for stolen letters, kisses for risk neither of them could afford. When Samuel died at Shiloh, she buried a lock of his hair in a tin under her mother's pie safe. Years later, her grandson found it by accident. A secret carried so long that when it came to light, it turned family history on its head. Or the story of a letter, maybe real, maybe not, but true in spirit. A mother, worn thin by decades of silence, leaves her grown child a folded page tucked in a cedar box. My boy, they told me to forget him. They said he was the wrong color, the wrong side of the river, but he gave me you, my only right thing. His name was Jonas. You have his eyes. Back in that stockade, there was no talk of names or futures. There was only the slow, dangerous thaw of two people daring to trust each other. A tin cup of water passed through cold hands. A scrap of cloth pressed to a bullet wound that no one else would stitch. A lullaby in a language Eleanor would never understand, hummed low as a promise in the dark. And in that place, where barbed wire split the world into them and us, the seed of something reckless took root. It would wait years, buried deep, until the night Eleanor Shaw would stand in the rain with a boy named Finn McCrae pressed to her heart and whisper the truth that once saved a life, now demanding to save a legacy. The wind smelled of cedar and old secrets when Eleanor Shaw finally reached the ridgeline above Raven Ridge. Behind her lay miles of broken trail, rivers crossed at dawn, ridges climbed on blistered feet, each step cracking open the part of her heart she'd spent years stitching shut. Ahead lay a village that had not spoken her name in years, and the man she was about to drag the past straight into. The storm had risen out of nowhere, sweeping down from the high pass in rolling waves. Now it slammed into the pine grove with a force that bent the trees and turned wagon ruts into rivers of mud. Eleanor hunched her shoulders tighter around the small shape bundled in her arms. Finn McCrae slept against her breast, his dark lashes damp with rain, his cheek pressed to the heartbeat that had carried him this far. What drives a woman to brave a storm in a hostile village? Just to say, he's yours. That question followed every step she took down the narrow path toward the settlement. She could almost hear her mother's voice in it, heavy with disappointment. You should have let him believe you were dead, should have stayed gone. But she couldn't. There were some truths too heavy for one heart to carry alone. Truths that had roots in that stockade so many years ago. In that small firelight flickering over a man with eyes like midnight and hands steady enough to stop a wound from bleeding out. The Raven Ridge settlement lay huddled in the pines below. Smoke curled through the storm from the gaps in buffalo hide door flaps. Firelight flickered behind thin lodge walls, every shadow telling her she did not belong here anymore, if she ever had. She shifted Finn closer, feeling his tiny hand twitch in his sleep. His breath warmed the hollow beneath her collarbone, the only warmth she had left to give. Sometimes she thought of stories she'd heard during the quiet hours in the boarding house where she'd given birth to Finn alone. There was one about a carpenter's daughter back east, a grown woman now, who found an old envelope sealed in wax after her mother died. Inside, only a line. Your father was not the man they told you. He was the boy who carved you a toy horse behind the church. The boy they called worthless because his skin was too dark for their pews. That daughter, they said, packed her bags and rode 3 counties over to stand at a grave no one tended, just to speak the name her mother had been too afraid to carve in stone. It didn't fix the shame they'd buried, but it named it, and that counted for something. Eleanor wondered if Finn would one day stand over her grave asking the same questions. Would he hate her for this moment, for this long road through the storm, carrying him into a village that might spit him out like spoiled meat? Mud sucked at her boots as she stepped between the lodges. Shadows stirred behind stitched hides. She felt the eyes, the whispers, pressed into the folds of the wind. They knew her face, or thought they did. The white nurse who'd lain with a Cheyenne man, the woman who'd vanished into the mist with a belly full of war's ruin. Jonas McCrae's lodge sat at the far end of the clearing, larger than the rest. Cedar poles lashed tight, buffalo hides stitched and layered thick against the storm. Its door flap glowed faintly from the fire inside. Eleanor paused there, one hand braced against the wood. Finn stirred, a small sound catching in his throat. She knocked once, knuckles splitting the hush. A heartbeat passed, then the flap lifted. Jonas stood there, shoulders bare, hair loose around his face, rain dripping from his brow. He looked older, broader, but the storm in his eyes hadn't changed. Their gazes locked. Not surprise, but recognition sparking like dry grass under lightning. You don't have to believe me, Eleanor said, her voice raw but steady. She shifted Finn so his face caught the light. But this boy, he's yours. And somewhere behind Jonas, the warmth of the fire flickered like a promise that might yet survive the storm. By the time the storm lifted its weight off the ridges, rumor had already done its damage. The Raven Ridge settlement woke to news that Eleanor Shaw had returned with a child whose eyes mirrored Jonas McCrae's like dawn mirrors dusk. Some called it betrayal, some called it shame come walking on 2 small feet. But to Ruth Calder, it was a theft, and she would not stand quiet. She found Eleanor at the well just past sunrise, her boots still caked in the road's grime. Finn clung to Eleanor's shawl, peering out at the village that watched him back with eyes that didn't bother to hide their suspicion. Ruth stood across the well, arms folded in a fur cloak stitched with dyed elk hide. Her hair was braided tight, a single bone pin holding it in place. A mark that she was more than just Orson Pike's daughter. She was the promise of an alliance generations deep, one that had kept the clan from tearing itself apart when the soldiers came with treaties and lies. "Why did you come back, Eleanor?" Ruth asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to draw blood. "What did you think you'd find here?" Eleanor dipped her bucket into the cold water, her shoulders stiff but unbowed. "I came because truth shouldn't rot in silence. He deserves his name." Ruth stepped closer, her shadow falling over Finn. The boy tucked himself tighter behind his mother's side. "Name?" Ruth's laugh was small, brittle. "What good is a name if it cuts apart what keeps us alive?" The Raven Ridge clan had survived everything thrown at it. Smallpox winters, forced marches, the hunger years when the herds fled south. Through it all, promises held the walls together. Alliances were forged not by paper but by daughters given and sons pledged. A marriage like Ruth's to Jonas wasn't just about love. It was about land, trust, survival. Jonas's bloodline, Cheyenne through his mother, Raven Ridge by adoption, had been the knot binding two stubborn families. Ruth's family, the Calders, brought the mountain grazing routes. Jonas's ties kept peace on the western hunting trails. Break that knot, and the past might come roaring back like spring floods. Eleanor saw that history in Ruth's eyes. The fear twisted around her pride like barbed wire. But fear didn't make truth any less true. "Do you think he'll just send us away?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. "Pretend none of it ever happened?" Ruth's jaw clenched. "I think he knows where his loyalties lie." In the hush that followed, Finn shifted, his fingers brushing the well's rim. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the tension, the way children always do when grown-ups try to hide the sharp edges. It's easy to judge love that crosses lines, until it's your own blood. The thought rose like a ghost behind Eleanor's ribs. Once, in a mining town south of here, two families spent years spitting on each other's doorstep. One was Irish, the other Lakota. Their feud was older than their children, but when a girl named Moira fell for a Lakota boy named Amos, they met behind the grain mill, fingers laced together in the dust. They had a son before either family would speak the other's name. That boy grew up learning to fight twice as hard for half as much. By the time he was old enough to stand on his own, both families had nearly buried themselves in debt and grudges. He came back with 2 horses and a deed to the land they'd bled for, and forced them to stand side by side and sign it over to him. He built a barn on that ridge. He named it 2 Fires. Sometimes the ones born between worlds carry the bridge, everyone else is too scared to walk. Ruth leaned in then, her voice dropping low so the child wouldn't hear. "You think you're brave, Eleanor, but all you've done is drag this boy into a place that will eat him alive. And for what? So you can say you didn't lie?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She reached for Finn's hand, holding it tight, so he'll never have to wonder if he was worth the truth. Behind them, the wind whispered through the pine tops. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a hawk wheeled overhead, watching, waiting, a promise that not every line drawn in blood is forever. The first days after Eleanor's return were the hardest for Finn McCrae, though he never would have found the words for it. To a child, belonging is something you feel in your bones before you ever understand it in your mind. You feel it when you run barefoot through the grass with other children shouting your name, when a mother in the village hands you an extra piece of sweetbread, when your laughter folds into the bigger laughter around the fire, and you feel it twist when that warmth disappears. In Raven Ridge, the children already knew what the adults had whispered for years, that the line between us and not us was thin but sharp as a blade. At first, some of the braver boys tugged Finn into their games, racing between the drying hides, daring him to climb the old cedar stump near the river's edge. He was quick, bright-eyed, eager to please, but all it took was one mother's harsh word at dusk. "Come away from him. That one doesn't belong." And the gap widened overnight. A few days later, Finn tried to share a handful of blackberries with a boy named Eli near the fishing traps. Eli slapped his hand away, sending the berries tumbling into the mud. The other boys laughed, not cruelly at first, just the way kids do when they feel bigger by pushing someone smaller aside. But behind their giggles lurked the same old grudges handed down like a family heirloom. Sometimes Finn would come back to the healer's tent, his knees scraped raw, his hair full of pine needles. Eleanor would kneel in front of him, wiping away the dirt with the corner of her shawl. He never said much. He'd just sit there, eyes fixed on the ground, the bruise of exclusion already blooming in his young heart. Raven Ridge could be a shelter, the kind that kept out storms, wolves, the harsh grip of winter. But it could also suffocate the ones who didn't quite fit under its hides. People spoke of loyalty, tradition, bloodlines, but they did not speak of mercy for the child caught between all three. Children pay the price when adults cling to old grudges. The thought echoes in the hush, a truth too many villages have carried into the grave. Yet sometimes there were small sparks of quiet defiance. People still spoke, in hushed and half-admiring tones, about Sheriff Walter Kincaid. Long dead now, but his story lingered like wood smoke in the pines. Kincaid had been a rough man, a frontier lawman who rode with a shotgun across his saddle and a battered Bible in his pocket. One winter, he found a half-tribe boy abandoned behind the sawmill, a sick child with no name and no kin who would claim him. Folks muttered that Kincaid should send the boy away, that bringing him under his roof would bring trouble. But Kincaid just narrowed his eyes and told them, "This child's worth more than your gossip." He raised that boy like his own, taught him to shoot straight and ride hard. When Kincaid was buried under the Pine Ridge, it was that boy, grown now, wearing his old silver star, who lowered him into the earth. Some people in the village still shook their heads at the mistake that was never a mistake at all. Finn didn't know Sheriff Kincaid's story yet, but the echo of that kind of love hovered near him every time Jonas carved him a small wooden bird or pressed a scrap of dried meat into his palm when no one was looking. It was clumsy, unfinished, but it was the start of a bridge no rumor could burn. One night, Finn lay curled on the straw beside Eleanor, his breath warm against her arm. She brushed his hair back from his brow, whispering promises she wasn't sure the village would ever keep. "You're not a mistake," she murmured. "Not here, not anywhere." Outside, the village fires flickered low. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked once, then fell silent. And in the hush, a boy who carried two worlds in his small hands dreamed of a place where he wouldn't have to choose which half to hide. It began with the sound of a stone hitting flesh, that dull, hollow thwack that makes even grown men flinch. Eleanor heard it from the trading post, her hands full of dried roots she'd hoped to barter for a warm meal. She turned just in time to see the dust rising at the edge of the clearing. The circle of boys hunched close like buzzards, picking at something too small to fight back. Finn's cry was not loud. He'd already learned not to give them the satisfaction. She dropped everything and ran, skirts catching on brambles, boots skidding in the soft mud near the fish racks. But she was too far, and they were too many. Finn was on the ground, arms curled around his head. One boy knelt on his back to pin him down. Another boy, the one with a fresh hunting knife strapped to his belt like a man twice his age, held a rock aloft, testing its weight like a promise. "Half-blood," one of them sneered. "Doesn't belong. Doesn't belong." Before Eleanor's voice could tear free, before she could reach him, something cracked through the ring of jeering boys like a split log exploding in a fire. Jonas McCrae, he came roaring down the path like the storm that had brought Eleanor here in the first place. He didn't shout. He didn't waste breath on threats. He simply slammed his shoulder into the boy with the rock, sending him sprawling into the weeds. Another swung at him, a child's desperate swing, fueled more by fear than hate. But Jonas blocked it with the flat of his arm, then pushed him aside like a dry branch snapping underfoot. In 2 strides, Jonas dropped to his knees in the mud. He gathered Finn into his arms, pressing the boy's small, shaking shoulders to his chest. When another stone came flying from behind, a final cheap shot, Jonas didn't duck. It struck him square between the shoulder blades, mud spraying up his back. He didn't flinch, didn't even turn to see who had thrown it. His body was a wall around his son now, and nothing would breach it. Villagers were gathering, drifting from door flaps and cook fires, drawn by the sound of fists and fear. They lined the clearing in a loose ring, eyes darting between Jonas and the boys, between Eleanor's pale face and Finn's muddy hair. Slowly, Jonas stood. His coat clung to him, rain-soaked and streaked with dirt. He kept Finn pressed to him, one hand spread firm over the boy's back, like he was anchoring him to the earth. Then his voice rose, not a shout, but a declaration that cut through the hush like an axe-splitting kindling. This child! He turned, sweeping the gathered faces with a gaze so steady it made grown men shift their weight and look at their boots. This child is mine, my blood, my flesh, and I do not hide him anymore. A ripple ran through the crowd. A mother gasped, a young man spat in the dirt, an elder murmured a prayer half under his breath. But Jonas didn't flinch from any of it. Behind him, Eleanor's breath shivered through her cracked lips. She could see the question in every glance that met her eyes. How dare you? How dare you come back and make this our problem too? And yet, there was another question there too, unspoken but ancient as the first child born of two worlds. What would you have done? Would you stand up before your entire town? Would you speak the truth that cost you everything? Your peace, your place, your carefully brokered alliances, just to give your child what is his by right? Families like theirs have always walked this edge. Some choose silence, letting children grow up with questions that eat holes in their hearts. Some bend so far trying to belong that they break. And then, now and again, one stands in the mud, shoulders squared, stone still lodged between his shoulder blades, and says, no more. Jonas bent his head to Finn's hair, his voice dropping low but strong enough for every ear to hear. You have my name. You have my heart. You are not a mistake. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a hawk wheeled through the pine tops. The village fire smoked into the pale dusk. And a boy once called not ours buried his face in his father's coat and knew, for the first time in his small life, that he was claimed. They left Raven Ridge at dawn, while the mist still clung to the pines like a secret the mountain was too tired to keep. Jonas McCrae led the way along the old trapper's trail, his pack heavy with seed, nails, and the last scraps of pride he'd once called duty. Eleanor followed, her hand resting lightly on Finn's shoulder every few steps, as if afraid he might vanish back into the hush between the trees. They came to Silver Hollow by nightfall, a slip of meadow where the river bent around a stand of birch. The ground was soft with moss and wild sage, the soil good enough for a stubborn heart to coax life from. Jonas built their cabin with his own rough hands, each cedar beam carved to lock into the next like puzzle pieces too honest to lie. He shaped a door from pine boards, hammered hinges from salvage iron, and marked the lintel with a small carved bird, a promise that this place would hold. Eleanor planted mint and chamomile under the window, where sunlight caught the leaves each dawn. She strung dried wildflowers from the rafters to ward off the loneliness that sometimes scratched at the door when the nights grew too long. Finn ran barefoot through the grass from sunup to dusk, his laughter stitching the clearing together in a way no bloodline or clan council ever could. They said once, years before, a mail-order bride had come through this valley. A woman with raw hands and no kin, but the one who'd claimed her by letter. They gave her a patch of ground so barren it split shovels and tested prayers. But each spring she turned the soil with quiet resolve, tucking seeds deep enough that by the second year a garden bloomed wild. Tomatoes and sweet corn, squash curling around the fence posts like forgiveness made green. Forgiveness is never shouted from rooftops. It grows when one hand reaches for another. When a boy, muddy and grinning, presses a fistful of mint into his mother's palm. When a man who once hid from the truth stands in the doorway at dusk and says, "You are my blood, my flesh." Out there, in the hush of Silver Hollow, shame turned to belonging, and 3 souls learned what it meant to stay. So what does this old story in Silver Hollow whisper to us now, all these years and miles away? Maybe it reminds us that sometimes the biggest storms we face aren't the ones outside our door, but the ones inside our hearts. The silence we carry, the secrets we bury, the shame we pass down when we're too proud or too afraid to speak the truth. Maybe it asks us to look at our own families, our neighbors, our communities, and wonder, who's still standing in the mud, waiting to be claimed? Who's still made to feel like they don't belong just because they were born between worlds we'd rather keep apart? In a country as wide and diverse as America, We've all got branches in our family trees we don't always talk about. Stories that hurt, stories that heal. But sometimes the best way to break old curses is to stand up and say, this is mine. This is us. This is enough. Some people may hear this tale and see only a love story. Some may hear it as a story about family, sacrifice, or the quiet fight to be seen. But we hope you see it for what it really is. A reminder that forgiveness doesn't come in shouts. It comes in small hands holding tight, in doors open when storms rage, and in promises we choose to keep. Thank you for listening, truly. If this story warmed your heart or made you think twice about what belonging means, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more timeless tales like this one. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep your porch light on for the lost ones finding their way home.